October 14th, 1943, 23,000 feet over Germany. The tracers look like meteors, and a wing of bombers learns what color fear is. The gunners squeeze butterfly triggers until the metal stings their palms, and the belts crawl from ammunition boxes like feeding serpents. A pilot banks into the attack, and the sky blooms with red lines that seem to bend and curve, although they fly straight and indifferent. Somewhere below, a farmer hears thunder, where the weather is clear and thinks of distant storms. This is the story of the machine gun that turned the skies red, and of the men and ideas that aimed it. We begin inside a cockpit where oxygen tastes like cold tin, and everything valuable fits into a circle of glass. The propeller vibrates into a silver disc, and the headset crackles with a short word that means everything. Break. A shape crosses the sun and becomes an airplane, and then becomes a threat, and then becomes a target. The hand finds the gun switch by memory, not by sight, and the thumb travels the safe arc between doubt and decision. The barrels are still cool, and there is a second to notice how quiet the world tries to be before it screams. The first burst is a confession that can never be taken back. The tracers appear only 1 in 5, but memory paints them all. The nose dips, and the wing shudders with recoil, and the smell of burnt powder sneaks under the mask. A voice on the radio says, "You're high 12," and another says, "I see him," and another says nothing at all. Someone will write that the air tasted of coins. Someone will draw a thin red line on a map and remember that it was not ink. However, the scene is not only sensation, it is a choice built by decades of argument, calculation, and manufacturing. The thesis is simple. Air combat in the age of fast monoplanes became a problem of delivering enough energy in a brief window, and the simplest reliable answer was the belt-fed machine gun scaled to aircraft speed and mass. The tools varied by nation and doctrine, yet the logic converged in firepower concentration and logistic endurance. Indeed, the machine gun became a language that every pilot could speak under stress. Pull here, lead there, hold for 1 second, and pray you will not need 2. To understand why the skies turned red, we step back into the late 1930s when engineers tried to predict the future with slide rules and caution. Biplanes were departing. All metal monoplanes arrived with retractable gear and enclosed cockpits and higher wing loadings. Closing speeds doubled and then doubled again in practice, if not on paper. Rifle-caliber guns that once shredded canvas now sprinkled sparks on aluminum skins. Therefore, designers faced an equation of time on target versus destructive effect. They could fire many small bullets quickly or fewer heavier bullets that carried explosive charges. Britain trusted batteries of light guns at first and filled wings with lines of Brownings. Germany bet on a mix of fast, heavy machine guns and compact autocannons. America refined a big, simple design into a workhorse that would sit in wings, turrets, and noses from the first day to the last. Japan adapted foreign mechanisms to its own metallurgy and tactics and learned strengths and limits at sea. The Soviet Union began with blistering rates of fire from rifle-caliber guns, then rushed to heavier weapons when experience demanded. A quiet memo from one air ministry could change the armament of a nation, and a single report from a frontline squadron could change the memo. An instructor would tell young pilots that they would get about 2 seconds of stable firing on an average pass, and less if they were foolish. He would say that those 2 seconds had to count. A test officer would chalk circles on a target and point to the fraction that spray fire ever truly hit. He would say that dispersal hides failure, but the wreckage of a bomber tells the truth. By then, most nations agreed that putting guns where the pilot looked was better than burying them deep, and that harmonizing convergence mattered more than any heroic myth of a single layer of armor. Numbers crept into doctrine. Rates of fire in rounds per minute. Muzzle velocities in meters per second. Projectile mass in grams. Penetration at 100 yards at 20 degrees. It is easy to drown in figures, and missed the human consequence that every number was a bet on a stranger's life. Stage 1 is disbelief, because all wars begin in the shadow of the last war. In the years just before the storm, some officers laughed at the idea that a handful of guns could stop determined attackers. They believed that escort fighters would be sparse, that formations would be loose, and that defensive weapons were mostly for morale. They had not yet seen interlocking arcs of fire, hardwired into the geometry of daylight raids. Others underestimated the effect of autocannon. They saw the muzzle flash and not the shell that carried a bursting charge into the wing root. They remembered battles fought with fabric and forgot that speed sets its own rules. An engineer filed a report that a light rifle bullet would drill neat holes, and a heavier aircraft gun would set entire sections ablaze, and the report sat on a shelf because budgets are arguments disguised as arithmetic. A pilot wrote that he could walk the tracers across a target, like throwing a switch and turn a living machine into a falling star, and someone in an office marked the letter, answered, and closed the folder. In reality, the first campaigns punished illusions. Formations that expected to brush attackers aside with a few light guns learned that attackers came in from the blind spots in 2s and 4s, in dives and climbs, in patterns that a chalkboard never captured. Aircraft that tried to save weight with minimal armament discovered that weight returns anyway as armor, self-sealing tanks, and redundant systems. Tactics evolved because the alternative was funerals. Stage 2 is the pivot, when a system proves itself under stress, and the skeptics go quiet. A clear day over a channel or a continent will do. The defenders track a line of intruders and scramble, and when they close the range and press the triggers, the air fills with incandescent punctuation. Pilots will later say that tracers saved lives because they turned guesswork into feedback. They will also say that tracers killed friends because they tempted men to keep firing when discipline said stop. A diary entry notes that the first time you press the trigger, the airplane feels like a different species, and the engine note changes because you are asking the machine to do 2 jobs at once. A mechanic writes that gun gas leaves brown stains along the wing root, and that a mirrored sight gathers tiny black specks, and that no matter how carefully he cleans, there's always one more. A radio transcript from an interception carries 3 lines that survive on a reel. Here they come. Hold it. Break now. The middle line is the one that matters, because it is the echo of years of drills that made hands and eyes keep faith with mathematics. The turning point is also industrial. A nation decides to accept the friction of making millions of cartridges with tight tolerances and reliable primers and belts that will not tear when the wing flexes in turbulence. Factories teach new hands to handle nitrocellulose as carefully as milk, and to search for flaws by touch in the dark. Women who have never seen a front line learn to measure by feel and hear a bad crimp with their fingertips. Inspection becomes ritual because a single dud in a tight window can erase a pilot. Once the belts and barrels are steady, the pilots notice something brutal and simple. Concentration wins. 6 to 8 heavy guns aimed into a harmonized cone will break a twin engine bomber in one long burst. A dozen guns in a defensive ring will force an attacker to flinch or die. The red lines do not respect courage. They reward geometry and timing. Stage 3 is dominance, when the doctrine stops wobbling and stands up. Short sentences belong here because that is how the bursts sound. Find, close, fire, break, climb, reform. Production surges, and with it confidence. Flying schools teach deflection not as art, but as habit. Gunnery ranges carve the countryside into lanes of angles and seconds. A young pilot learns to picture the invisible spiral of a converging stream and to hold his nerve for the extra half second that feels like a lifetime. He learns to count in beats not numbers. He learns to fire in packets that match the time his sights can promise. He becomes a metronome of violence. Statistics pile up as proof and warning. Most rounds miss. The ones that land decide everything. Gun cameras show the dance frame by frame. A wing root sprouts debris. A canopy blows away. A plume of glycol occurs where an engine used to be. By then, everyone understands that reliability is doctrine. A system that feeds in cloud, rainfrost, and fear is worth more than a clever weapon that sulks in cold weather. Armorers speak with pride about headspace and timing as if these were prayers. Pilots praise guns that tolerate sloppy belts and bad days because real combat supplies both. The anatomy of the dominant gun is plain. A heavy cartridge with a blunt honesty of momentum. A receiver that cycles by recoil or short recoil or gas, with a stubborn refusal to quit. A feed that accepts a linked belt without tantrum. A barrel change that respects numb fingers. An accuracy that is good enough at 200 yards and still meaningful at 4. The comparison with light autocannon is not a sermon, but a trade. Cannon shells solve problems with fewer hits at the cost of recoil weight and limited ammunition. Machine guns solve problems by volume at the cost of longer exposure and the discipline to close to lethal range. Commanders choose based on targets' typical missions and the suppliers who answer the phone. The battlefield chooses based on weather and surprise. Dominance also means adaptation. Turrets find better fields of fire. Remote mounts learn to obey electric whispers. Wing panels thicken to hold more ammunition and are shaped to vent fumes away from intakes. Tracer chemistry improves so that the lines burn long enough to teach, but not so long that they betray the shooter at dusk. Pilots whisper thanks for armor glass, and then curse it when oil and powder haze make it a mirror. Ground crews build superstitions around barrel counts and belt lengths and talismans of cork and string. Every victory photo hides an army of hands that never fly, yet live with the same stakes. However, success accumulates a bill. Stage 4 is consequence. A war fought with streams of red light leaves after images in those who survive. Men who once wrote about wind now write about smell. Ozone. Burned rubber. Hot metal. A veteran explains that his ears changed forever on the day he fired long bursts through thin air because the aircraft becomes a drum and you are trapped inside it. Another says that at first he watched the tracers for beauty, and later he learned to ignore them because beauty was a poor teacher. Aircraft designers read casualty tables and change airframes. Tanks of fuel move inward. Cables gain redundancy or vanish in favor of hydraulics. Engines receive fire suppression. Pilots are told to fly in ways that cancel the best enemy solutions and to accept boredom as a weapon. A historian writes that daylight strategic raids without heavy defensive guns would have been ritual suicide, and that escort fighters without concentrated wing batteries would have been moral support and nothing more. Another historian replies that guns without tactics are noise, and that the real triumph was the marriage of training logistics and courage that allowed daylight to remain possible. Both are correct, because weapons cannot be separated from the systems that feed them. In reality, the machine gun that turned the skies red did not end with the armistice. Jets arrived and missiles followed, yet guns stayed because they answer the cheapest question in war, which is what to do when you are close enough to see the other person's face. Cold mornings over new countries taught the same old lessons with new airframes, different metals, same seconds. On some ridgelines, the red lines returned, and on some coasts, night tracers scribbled on the sea with the same handwriting. Pilots argued again about cannon versus heavy machine gun, and engineers shook their heads because the answer remained, it depends. It depends on what you are shooting at, and where and how much time you have, and whether you trust your supply chain more than your luck. Therefore, the moral is not about caliber. It is about humility before the physics of speed and the psychology of fear. A machine gun on an aircraft is a contract with time. It says that if you can put enough energy into a small space, within 2 heartbeats, the world will change. It says that if you miss those heartbeats, you will not get them back. Technology made the contract legible. Discipline made it payable. Courage made it real. The red lines in the sky taught crews to believe in angles and in each other. They taught engineers to worship reliability and taught commanders to stop pretending that optimism can patch a hole in a wing. They taught nations that industry is strategy written in warehouses. Every belt links a factory to a cockpit, and every cartridge is a vote that the next second will matter. Toward the end of a long war, a young pilot wrote that he wanted to count stars again, and not tracers. He wrote that the silence after shutdown was the only music that did not hurt. He wrote that he had met many brave men, and that the bravest were often the ones who never raised their voices. After the war, he found that on summer nights, far from airfields, he could still taste metal on the wind. He said it was probably in his head, and smiled and did not explain. This story is about guns, but also about memory. The machine that turned the skies red was built from steel chemistry training logistics and the stubborn refusal to accept that 2 seconds cannot be shaped. It took skeptical officers, factories full of tireless hands, crews who made rituals of checklists, and pilots who learned to put a calm cross where terror lived. It cost much and returned survival. It made bravery ordinary, which was perhaps its greatest cruelty. In the end, there is only one true conclusion. Firepower changes probability, not fate. You can tilt the odds with belts, barrels, and discipline. You cannot promise anyone a tomorrow. That truth is colder than oxygen and older than any design. Yet inside a canopy, with a world of metal and light around you, there is consolation in knowing that the tools in your hands will work as promised if you do. That is what a great machine gun offers in the air. Not magic, not mercy. Function that endures when nerves shake. Lines of red that tell you where the math is and where it demands you to be. Therefore, if you ever see old gun camera film and think of it as flickering history, remember that for the people inside those frames, there was no past tense. There was only a window shrunk to seconds and a contract signed in powder smoke. By then, the sky itself had learned a new kind of handwriting, and history learned to read it. And if a final sentence must exist, it is this: we inherit their lessons, so that we may count stars and not tracers. Narrated by Qarnox Noir Chronicles. Subscribe for more untold chapters of history.